Welcome to today's Jewish Policy Center webinar. Today, we're going to discuss the growing serious problem of anti-Semitism, not at the college level, but in the K-12 systems. And our guest today, Rebecca Schgallis, is extremely well prepared to discuss this in some detail. Before I introduce Rebecca, I'll give a very short commercial for the Jewish Policy Center, which we always do. We are a nonprofit think tank here in Washington, D.C., and we stand a little bit to the right of center. We're interested in all sorts of issues, primarily foreign policy, foreign affairs, and defense, U.S.-Israel relations, Middle East in general, and at home, domestic issues, including finance, economy, taxation, constitutional rights, and education. And we are always happy for you to support the Jewish Policy Center work, to subscribe to our quarterly magazine, In Focus. You can find us at jewishpolicycenter.org, where you can also make a contribution, which we would greatly appreciate. And you can always find us in our latest information, our insight and our In Focus releases, articles, op-eds at our website. And In Focus magazine is in hard copy and on the website. So there's no reason for you not to be up to speed with our work anytime. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce Rebecca Schgallis. And disclosure, Rebecca and I are friends. And in fact, I have tried to assist in some small ways at some times with an organization she founded, United Against Antisemitism, which is an advocacy organization that combats anti-Semitism at the K-12 levels. She is also Senior Education Strategist for the CAMERA Education Institute. CAMERA, as I'm sure many of you are aware, the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis, based in Boston. Rebecca was the Humanities Department Chair at Thomas Jefferson High School for the Science and Technology here in Virginia, or I should say next door in Virginia, teaching history, religion, and government. She holds master's degrees in both education and history, specializing in American and 20th century German history, with a focus on the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. Rebecca, it's a pleasure to welcome you today to our JPC webinar. And let me start with what I suppose is obvious from the introduction. We know that anti-Semitism has reached alarming levels at the college, university level. But many people, including some Jewish parents, are being surprised to find that anti-Jewish prejudice increasingly affects K-12 schooling. Tell us how the problem first came to your attention and how you got involved in fighting it.
So thank you, Eric. Thank you for having me today. So I became aware of the problem actually after I had left Thomas Jefferson High School. I was home with my children. It was COVID, and I was following a discussion about immediately after George Floyd that Thomas Jefferson alumni were having regarding the admissions process and even changing the name of the school. And they were using this language that I was not familiar with. And ultimately I started Googling things and discovered that what they were discussing was kind of rooted in critical race theory. And this was something somewhat new to me. And I started reading more about it. And as I was reading more about it, I became aware that there was this overlap with anti-Semitism, because critical race theory, of course, is rooted in Marxism. And whenever we're discussing these extremes, whether it's white supremacy or Marxism, this is where anti-Semitism finds a home. And so in kind of learning that language and seeing what was taking hold in schools, I started to become alarmed. Then in May of 2021, we had a school board member in Fairfax County who, when Hamas was firing rockets into Israel, the school board member in Fairfax labeled Israel an apartheid colonizing state on her social media. And so parents and I gathered and we decided to reach out to the school and get involved on that particular issue. But in the course of our discussions together, we discovered that there was numerous incidents of anti-Semitism in Fairfax County schools that parents had brought to the attention of school administrators for years that had essentially gone unaddressed.
This is, when I first learned of it, I was just stunned. Our viewers should know that Fairfax County, Virginia, which is a near suburb of Washington, D.C., is one of the, depending on your measurement, mean income, is one of the 2, 3, 4 wealthiest counties in the United States. Fairfax County Public School System is one of the biggest, with over 100,000 students and a budget of $3 billion a year. And to find that there is a pattern of chronic anti-Semitism or anti-Semitic incidences not being adequately addressed in this sort of a school system was stunning. Tell our viewers about this Title VI complaint that the United Against Antisemitism initiated at the Federal Department of Education level against Fairfax County.
Sure. So when we first gathered as parents and started cataloging these incidents that had occurred for a number of years, we reached out to several Jewish organizations, including the Zionist Organization of America, the ZOA. And the ZOA determined that there had been, incidents that violated Title VI. And so ZOA reached out to the school district and sent a letter of concern with a list of recommendations that they could help them institute to correct this problem. The school district ignored that initial letter from ZOA, which was quite shocking because we were essentially saying that the school district was ignoring anti-Semitism. And then when we raised the issue, they ignored that as well. So the ZOA followed up a few months later with the Title VI complaint. And that complaint details the incidents that students have experienced for years, many of it ranging from swastika graffiti that stays up for years, even when parents complain about it. The complaint details how it was easier and faster to change the name of a school in Fairfax County than it was to remove one example of some swastika graffiti that was in a different school. It details how students perform Nazi salutes and sing happy birthday to Hitler. They tell very offensive Holocaust jokes to Jewish students. So these incidents, as I said, they were ongoing for years. And then we also detailed the lack of response from school administrators. And so the Office of Civil Rights, it took about 10 months or so for the Office of Civil Rights to open an investigation. That investigation has been ongoing now.
This might be a good time. You mentioned Nazi salutes in schools. And I think before we get too far into these related questions, which are all extremely pertinent, I know you have some presentation, a short video slides you want to show us. And I think one of them actually, at least one, includes Nazi salute in school. So maybe we should roll that right now.
Sure.
Can we do that?
Yes.
Okay.
Hold on. There we go. Do you see the?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So, if we're talking about kind of anti-Semitism in K-12 schools, we can break this down into two categories: student behavior and curriculum and policy. And prior to October 7th, as we were discussing, student behavioral incidents, for the most part, relied upon white supremacist ideology, swastikas, students singing happy birthday to Hitler, Nazi salutes such as this. This was actually taken during an auto tech class. Even in other school districts in the DC area, we have incidents of boys who wear a kippah to school and have had their kippah removed and assaulted. Since October 7th, though, students have been targeted, Jewish students have been targeted for their connection to Israel. And so in Virginia, as well as throughout the country, high school Muslim student associations have organized walkouts in support of humanitarian aid for Palestine, using social media and a toolkit created by outside organizations. These walkouts were not as student-led as school administrators would claim they were. Jewish students and parents went to these walkouts to record them and ultimately expose them. And not surprisingly, they found that as the protests continued, students became more emboldened in their anti-Semitism. Students screamed things like, "You are murdering children," at the Jewish students who would attend these protests, kind of encounter protests. We should keep in mind that the number of Jewish students attending encounter protests would be 5 to 7, compared to the 150 to 300 students who were protesting, in support of Gaza. They chased parents at one of these walkouts, telling a parent that they should kill themselves. They even put swastikas on their signs. And at one protest, the student leading it yelled into the bullhorn, "Long live Hamas." Where Jewish students attended, we should also note that they were warned by administrators to remain silent, denying them their own free speech rights. The school district, after each of these walkouts, reported to the community that the walkouts were orderly. So here's some other pictures from these walkouts. Just 2 weeks later, after these walkouts, students at one of the Muslim Student Association clubs requested to show this movie, Occupation 101, which we should note that the production or producers of this movie are actually the uncle of the school board member that I mentioned earlier, who had called Israel an apartheid state. The film argues quite simply that the root cause of the Arab-Israeli conflict is Zionism. And the film obviously erases history, outright lies, and justifies terrorism. And yet, school administrators, in discussing whether they should allow the film to be shown, said to me, "As a school, it's not our job to verify facts." In other Virginia schools, Jewish students are screamed at in the hallways, where students come up to them and say, "F Israel, Allah Akbar Jew, F you Zionist." Another student reports at a Virginia high school that a student in class said what Hitler accomplished was impressive. And so the question we need to ask ourselves is, why do school districts that have been aggressively fighting every form of hate for years seemingly shrug their shoulders and do not know what to do, or are not able to muster the moral courage when facing anti-Semitism? And so we mentioned George Floyd, and that was kind of the moment that I became aware that something nefarious was happening kind of underground. It was, bubbling to the surface. And so after George Floyd, school districts really remade their curriculum and policies to supposedly address racism. And so while some schools are mandating curriculum changes with initiatives like ethnic studies, we see that in California, Minnesota, but even when there's no formal curriculum mandate, school districts have adopted the ideology that lies behind ethnic studies, which is the oppressor ideology. And so all history, current events are seen through this binary. And of course, there's been lots of discussion about the binary and what it means for the Jewish community as well as for Israel. But we know that Jews, because of our perceived whiteness, our perceived success, are labeled as oppressors, and ignoring centuries of Jewish persecution. And then ignoring Jewish indigeneity, Israel is viewed as a white colonial settler apartheid state. And so those anti-Semitic tropes that have been applied to the Jewish community for centuries are now applied to the Jewish state, where they had been applied to us, making us the pariah in society. It's now applied to the Jewish state to make it the pariah amongst nations. And so on the screen here, you see the results of a Harvard Cap Harris poll that show that a large majority of college-age students support this oppressor binary. They think that Jews are the oppressors, and a third do not think that Israel has a right to exist. And so until we address this underlying ideology, we're not going to be able to combat anti-Semitism. Curricula using this simplistic oppressor binary to explain the Arab-Israeli conflict has proliferated and infiltrated our schools. This curricula promotes what we call a red-green alliance, red referring to Marxist ideology, green referring to Islamist ideology. And of course, the Marxist playbook intentionally targets young, pliable minds. So for example, Parseo, which is a social justice organization, has developed a curriculum called Challenging Antisemitism, whose whole purpose is to argue that anti-Zionism is not part of anti-Semitism. It's led by several as a Jew Jews who start their statements with as a Jew and then use their Jewishness to deny and reject Zionism as part and being integral of Jewish identity. And Parseo boldly states that they intend to bring their curriculum not only into K through 12 schools, but also into preschools. And another example of this that is being widely shared in schools across the country is the Zinn Education Project, named after Howard Zinn. Zinn is an anarchist socialist who wrote The People's History of the United States, which is very popular amongst US history teachers and used in classrooms throughout the country. But after October 7th, the Zinn Education Project curated a set of resources for the Arab-Israeli conflict, and they said students need to study the current crisis as shaped in large part by, quote, settler colonial history and conditions of apartheid. This is an example of a lesson they just released called Teaching the Seeds of Violence in Palestine, Israel. In the lesson, students represent various historical figures, but the author actually admits that he took the liberty in crafting the Palestinian peasants in the lesson. None of them are real, and even aspects of their story are completely made up. But the author reports that at the end of teaching this lesson with his own students, that his students, quote, recognize that what began as the Palestinians' land ended with appropriation and domination. And so Zinn Education Project is one of dozens of these curricula organizations that is out there promoting this material and being used by teachers across the country. School districts after October 7th have actually been recommending these resources. And in fact, in one high school, we know of a teacher who is dissatisfied with the slow pace at which her school district was recommending resources and took matters into her own hands, compiled a list, and sent out these resources to her school community. It should be noted that this teacher, according to FBI data, her father was a major fundraiser for Hamas and was an unindicted conspirator in the Holy Land Foundation and in the '93 World Trade Center bombing. In Massachusetts, another superintendent after October 7th sent a letter to the community claiming there's no right way to respond to October 7th and said the situation is evolving and there may not be clarity at the moment. He advised teachers to actually avoid sharing news articles and instead recommended some of the resources you see on the screen here. The letter was rescinded after a public outcry, but of course the school district's initial impulse is deeply troubling. It should be noted too that this curriculum is not just anti-Semitic. In Marxist Orwellian fashion, these activist curricular organizations invert and pervert the truth. In this example here, in Teaching While Muslim, a resource describes the Intifada as, quote, coordinated boycotts and other sophisticated revolts in a persistent effort to win Palestinian self-rule. So in other words, suicide bombings are now sophisticated revolts. So what do? There's lots of recommendations out there by various Jewish organizations. We've been fighting anti-Semitism for years. We should first have a note about Holocaust education, because many pro-Palestinian curricular organizations are currently engaged in a concerted effort to co-opt the Holocaust, all while doing this to fulfill state social studies, Holocaust or genocide state standards, in order to do, quote, normalize, in order to normalize Palestine. So, for example, we have found a teacher training that demonstrates how a teacher could use a poem by a Jewish child in a ghetto during the Holocaust as a jumping off point to then read a poem by a child living in Gaza. Obviously, Holocaust education is important, but we should distinguish between Holocaust education used for responding to an anti-Semitic incident versus Holocaust education that is part of the study of World War II. It should also be noted that just because a state has a mandate for teaching the Holocaust does not mean it's done well, does not mean that even more than one class period is used to teach about the Holocaust. We should also be careful too to think that teaching about the Holocaust will create some kind of sympathy for the Jews. We know after October 7th, the biggest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust did not elicit sympathy. In fact, people were celebrating within 24 hours after October 7th. So this debate about Holocaust education, you can see from the headlines there, is one that is being had in many of the Jewish organizations and needs to be handled carefully. It's not a silver bullet for dealing with this issue. The next issue that we need to address is this underlying oppressor-oppressed binary. This binary has become institutionalized in K-12 schools in a similar fashion that it has on college campuses in the diversity, equity, and inclusion offices. And DEI in K-12 oversees every decision-making process, from curriculum to instruction and teaching to disciplinary procedures. We know from Heritage Foundation research that DEI staff in general, this is looking at college DEI staff, not high school, show a disproportionate interest in Israel. In my experience working with K-12 schools, DEI officials do not understand Jews or anti-Semitism. They even sometimes crudely refer to Jewish students as Jew students. So while DEI departments in K-12 can sometimes respond to anti-Semitism when it's expressed as white supremacy, they will often struggle or have no response to anti-Semitism emanating from other minorities. In fact, here in Virginia, when a parent asked school administrators why the student who had been threatening her child for months with anti-Semitic death threats had not been suspended, the administrator responded, "Well, he's a minority too." So this is why former ADL and AJC presidents Foxman and Harris have called for an end to DEI, and why the larger Jewish community must also demand accountability from our current Jewish community leaders in ending their continued support of an ideology that has proven to be disastrous for the Jewish community. And lastly, I want to provide some actions that parents, grandparents can take immediately. First, start monitoring your schools and pay attention to your child's schoolwork. Look at their social studies classrooms, but also pay attention to their English classrooms. There's a large amount of literature, children's literature, that is making its way into the classroom that either erases Jewish history from Israel or labels Jews as settler colonists. Monitor the social media accounts of student activist groups in your school, even teachers. You'll discover upcoming events, protests, and even some anti-Semitic teachers possibly. Attend school board meetings and learn about proposed policy changes and the organizations your school is contracting with. Um, and then lastly, run your own approved candidates for school board, hold your own forums, and demand answers on anti-Semitism and DEI. And then I want to end with a little, plug here for camera. We are developing resources to help parents on the ground. We are developing a curriculum called The Story of the Jewish People in the Land of Israel that traces Jewish history over the millennia. We offer other resources for identifying many of these problematic resources that I have explained just now. And then we also offer strategic support to communities throughout the country that are dealing with anti-Semitism and want to address it. But most importantly, as parents, I think the most important thing that we can do is realize that obviously, anti-Semitism is our reality right now, especially for our students in K through 12. And it's important that we raise strong and resilient children who can who feel a connection to the state of Israel. So we'll stop sharing there.
Rebecca, I want to thank you for that very thorough presentation. And even though I was familiar beforehand with a little bit of that information, I learned a lot just now. And you're ahead of me, of course, as always. I was going to ask you a question about the Heritage Foundation study at the university level that found that the more active a DEI administrator was, the more there was a correlation with higher incidents of anti-Semitism on those campuses.
Right.
So yeah, this is sort of one of the tentacles of the snake here in this problem. I know that yesterday you participated in a panel discussion on Capitol Hill, organized by Congresswoman Virginia Foxx from North Carolina, who's the chairman of the Education and Workforce Development Committee. Could you tell us a little bit about what happened yesterday at that panel discussion? And given what you've just told us, was there anything hopeful coming out of that panel discussion?
So Parents Defending Education, which is an amazing organization that formed out of COVID, and many of the issues that we've discussed today, not specifically anti-Semitism, but the underlying ideological problems that we have going on in schools, organized this forum on Capitol Hill with Chairwoman Fox and her committee, because they too, like Camera, have been uncovering many of these problematic resources that are in schools. And so we met with Chairwoman Fox, and our big ask was that we wanted a K through 12 hearing similar to the one that took place in the fall for college presidents on anti-Semitism. And we were able to get a commitment that that will happen. Hopefully it will happen before the end of the school year. I can share that the members of Congress and their staffers that we met with are very committed to this issue and figuring out ways that the federal government can shine a light on the issue to put more pressure on it. I think it's important for parents to understand, of course, though, that in terms of the federal government, there isn't a lot that they can do when it comes to K through 12 issues. It's a very much a state issue and very much a local issue. So there's Title VI, but as you may be familiar, Title VI moves very slowly, and we have been waiting now with our Title VI investigation for I think it's been 2 years now. So ours predates October 7th. After October 7th, we've seen a huge increase in Title VI complaints at the K through 12 level, which we didn't see really before October 7th. And so while there's a lot of them that are under investigation, it can take years to resolve. And sometimes the resolution doesn't quite provide the resolution that's needed, obviously. So even though I think we have, thankfully, a lot of support in the halls of Congress, parents should not rely on the federal government to provide the answers here. That's one way that we can put pressure on this situation, but we need to pursue other avenues as well to force our schools to address this issue.
So let's say that I'm a parent in my local school system, and I was a parent in my local school system. My children are grown now. In fact, it was the Fairfax County Public Schools, although we're already talking a dozen years and more ago. And I see now, I recognize subsequently, the problem was already rearing its ugly head under the guise of multiculturalism. And my daughters had come home in junior high school and they would bring these worksheets home. And I told them, just fill these out, but don't pay any attention to them because multiculturalism is really another name for anti-Americanism, although even your teachers probably don't understand that in the way it was being used then. So that was sort of an inoculation. I had no suspicion at the time that it would deteriorate into this full-blown critical race studies, critical ethnic studies, assault on not only underlying American values, America supposedly as a racist country, but Jews as white adjacent and everything you've been talking about so far today. So let me ask you this. I'm a parent. Let's say I am a parent in a public school system, and my child comes home with an example of some anti-Semitic activity in the school system by other students, by a teacher, and the principal is not responding, the administrator is not responding. Can the parents work through their PTA or PTO organizations at the school, or you've already kind of indicated there are problems at the school board level, but since this is a local issue by and large, can they work through the PTA? Can they work through the school board?
So if the parent has already gone through the channels of trying to engage with the principal, if they don't get a satisfactory answer at the building level, they should then escalate it out of the building to the district office. If it's the assistant superintendent, even if it's the superintendent, they should escalate it to there. If after working through those channels, and it depends also on the seriousness of the issue. I think I want to offer this caveat because we are seeing an increase in students who are being physically assaulted or threatened in such a way that it's reasonable to think that an assault could happen. And so when that happens, parents need to take that seriously and call the police. This is no longer a school, behavioral problem. This is potentially criminal behavior that needs to be addressed in such a way, and they shouldn't rely on the school to do the right thing here. Um, if it doesn't fall into that category, then work it through the appropriate channels in the school. But if they're not getting the answer that they need and want, then I would recommend going to their personal school board member to see if they can offer any assistance on this issue. Sometimes they will step in and have a conversation with the superintendent. But that still may not bring them the answers that they need. And so they may need to go to outside organizations to bring in extra help, support, advocacy, depending on the types of situations that we're talking about, depending on whether there's other parents and students involved. This is how we get these grassroots movements starting of parents, because parents realize there's a pattern here. There's a pattern of behavior where it's acceptable for students to behave in an anti-Semitic way. And they're noticing, of course, that the school does take other forms of hate very, very seriously, but yet for anti-Semitism, they don't. And so sometimes the answer isn't going to come from solving it in the school. It's great when you have a principal that will. Every now and then, I get to work with a principal who is responsive and will even reach out to me because they're aware of something that might be coming and they want to get my take on it. But other times they ignore. And so when that happens, parents are going to have to build pressure on that situation.
One of the questions I've been looking at questions that listeners are sending in, and one of them just asked was the question of, could you address the role of teachers' unions in this situation? And I'll add my little asterisk to that. Teachers' unions' role within the school system, within curriculum development, and then politically in terms of creating kind of, as a labor union or labor unions, creating the atmosphere in which the problem already exists.
Right. Right. So a major problem in this is that the teacher unions, first of all, have enormous power in many of these school districts. When we're talking about New York City schools, Boston schools, these are very, very powerful teacher unions. And so even when the school may do the right thing, for example, in Maryland, we had a school district where parents uncovered uh, anti-Semitic social media posts by several teachers immediately after October 7th, even one where the teacher claimed that Israel was targeting Palestinians for their organs. So classic blood libel, anti-Semitism. The parents brought this information to the attention of the school administrators, and the school administrators actually put these teachers on leave. And they supposedly did an investigation. We don't know what that actually entails. Now, of course, I'm going to bring in another organization into this that also complicates this problem. CARE then got involved and engaged in lawsuits, and now those teachers have been reinstated. They have shuffled them around to other schools, but they're back teaching. So between CARE, but then also because of the teacher unions and these contracts that make it very challenging to discipline and even fire, problematic teachers. It's hard to imagine a teacher making racist statements on their social media and returning to a classroom and just being shuffled to another school as if that solves the problem. But yet for anti-Semitism, that's what happens. So on the one hand, it does make disciplining these teachers that are explicitly anti-Semitic, that makes it a huge problem. But then we also see that the teacher unions for years now, and I brought this to the attention of national media about almost 3 years ago. They have the teachers that go to the convention every year at the NEA, for example. These are going to be your most kind of fervent and strident union members who would want to spend 3 days with the union, debating union issues. And so it attracts the most activist teachers. And for years now, these activist teachers have been introducing new business items, NBIs, that are anti-Zionist and seek to promote kind of this narrative of Palestine in the classroom. They have now gotten to the point just this past summer where they're able to get some of these NBIs passed, where before they didn't have enough traction. Now, even before October 7th, they do. In addition to that, we see at the state level, the teacher unions issuing their own ceasefire resolutions. We see it happening at the local level. Some of them have been defeated, but at the state level, they're going through. And then in addition to that, there is an upcoming teachers union at the state level. They're holding their own Zoom meetings to discuss how do we teach about Palestinian racism in the classroom. So they're doing just like these other curricula organizations. And of course, the people that are part of some of these curricula organizations and the teachers unions are teachers in the classroom. There's a lot of overlap. And so they have the same mission.
That was disturbing.
Yes.
But it leads me, okay, from teachers to students. Another one of our viewers today has said that the Muslim student associations, we know in Fairfax County, different high schools have a Muslim student association, and it might look to a casual observer that's a one-off or a freestanding group, but our viewer says that the Muslim Student Association has been around for decades, has been anti-Israel for decades, and so I would add to this question, what's the backing for the Muslim Student Association? High school students come and go. But if the associations still exist, then they must have outside support. And you had mentioned just now, CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations. And I know there's another group that has been connected with or suspected of being connected with Muslim student associations, American Muslims for Palestine. What can you tell us about these organizations in terms of networking and where they come from?
So, so first of all, we should be clear that at least at the high school level, there are regulations in place that would make it um, very difficult, although I wouldn't put it past anybody at this point, for an outside organization to provide, direct funding to the school in some way. But that said, we know that, for example, in the walkouts, the students were using the same social media. They had a toolkit. We were able to digitally trace who created the toolkit. It wasn't a student. These were 20-somethings that work at, nonprofits in DC. And so what are their connections to other organizations? We would have to, figure that out. We know that in some of these walkouts in the DC region that there was, it appears to be direct involvement from CARE in helping to organize or provide support in some kind of manner. We also know that the AMP, for example, actually had come into a Muslim Student Association high school club time in Fairfax County about a week before October 7th to give a talk. And the person who came in has, a rap sheet of pages long of anti-Semitic statements, praising Hamas, praising the Holocaust. Let alone the anti-Black, anti-LGBTQ statements this person has made, that should have raised alarm by the teacher sponsor, the school. All these people had to sign off on this, but yet this person was allowed to come in and speak to the Muslim Student Association. So we don't necessarily know direct ties, but obviously there's some kind of influence that is taking place.
Suddenly now, or not suddenly, but over the course of this webinar, we're getting more and more questions. And another one has to do with perhaps outside funding, or at least funding for some of the, let's call them parent organizations. We know now, post-October 7th, it's finally being reported more widely. Qatar, the country of Qatar, has become a big funder at the university level for what are essentially Islamist-oriented curriculum programs. At the high school level, do we see, or K through 12 level, do we see any Qatari money going to organizations, teachers' unions, into the system somewhere?
Right.
Or not necessarily Qatar, other outside funding?
So there was a widely publicized story in the Free Press a couple months ago about a map that was funded by Qatar, a map of the Middle East that erases Israel. And this map had actually been up in this classroom for a number of years. Nobody noticed until October 7th that Israel had been erased, and then there was an outcry. So we do know that there are materials out there. We know that there are other curriculum organizations like Primary Source that exist that have funding. We know that the Brown University Choices program, there's a lot of Choices, first of all, is a curriculum program that used to be lesson plans on a particular topic, the French Revolution, let's say. But they have, over the last several years, kind of branched out into more social justice type lesson plans that they provide for teachers. School districts purchase the Choices program, and teachers at will can use this. So we know that, like, Fairfax County, for example, purchases the Choices program. How many teachers use it, I don't know. But we know that there is Qatar influence and money involved between Brown University as well as the department that produces Choices. So there is some influence there. We also have seen that, some of the books, the children's literature that has wound up in Gaza as part of UNRWA schools is some of the same books that we're seeing promoted in schools here in this country. Um, so there's a lot of concerning material that has made its way into the classroom. It's been there, many of it has been there for years, but since October 7th, it has just grown exponentially.
We're nearing the end of our normal program time, but I've got at least two more questions that I want to ask you. And one is from several of our viewers today, variations on the same theme. So let me warn you, I'm going to ask you to walk across some quicksand now. The viewers want to know, we have these pre-existing Jewish defense organizations, ADL, American Jewish Committee, local Jewish community relations councils, and I'm really not trying to sling any arrows at anybody, but we have these longstanding pre-existing organizations. So why, in the wake, not just of October 7th, but in the last few years, your own organization, United Against Antisemitism, why do you think they have had to spring up? Why have they become necessary?
So, the reason United Against Antisemitism and so many of these other parent organizations and many of the other organizations that are now even well known on college campuses, they formed because in many ways our Jewish establishment organizations um, really abandoned focusing on this issue of anti-Semitism that comes from the progressive left and these Islamist sources. And so when we were facing, anti-Semitism, we're still facing it in Fairfax County when we were uncovering it, we were concerned, obviously, about the white supremacist ideology that we found in student behavior. No one's diminishing the severity of what happens when a white supremacist shows up, and the violence that can ensue from that, obviously. But what we were seeing that was more concerning is um, the kind of the building blocks that were in place in the school to change policy. For example, they're still trying to revise a policy on controversial issues that currently teachers in Fairfax County and other schools have these similar types of policies, although they may have revised them since, that require teachers to teach a topic objectively and remain neutral and not indoctrinate. We were seeing efforts to revise this, to allow teachers to be anti-racist. And we brought these issues to our local Jewish leadership, and they didn't take these issues as seriously. At times when we raised these issues about finding examples of like woke kindergarten, which has found its way back in the news, but we found it almost 3 years ago in Fairfax County. We were finding this anti-Zionist, phenomenon already. They didn't want to address it. They have for years committed themselves to the progressive agenda, multiculturalism. And so to abandon that now is to admit that what they've been doing all these years may have been misguided. I think that's why, in part, so many in the Jewish community were so shocked after October 7th, because they had no idea that there was anti-Semitism on the left. Our Jewish leadership has been telling us for years that it's firmly on the right. That's the problem. And yes, of course, it's there, but it's also, um, you know, it's firmly on the left. And in part, it's more dangerous there because, um, you know, the progressive left has, in many parts of this country, controls our schools, our school boards, our teachers, our administrators, the media, all of our meaning-making institutions. And so our children are essentially hostage to this ideology. So while it's deeply disappointing, I think the Jewish community needs to start pressuring our Jewish communal leaders to become unified in fighting this underlying DEI ideology, and do a course correction here and quickly.
Okay, a moment ago I said two more questions.
Sure.
I was mistaken. Now it's two more questions. One, it occurs to me, we've talked about just now existing organizations. You talked before about the Title VI complaint before the Department of Education, attempting to work with school boards, attempting to work through PTAs at the local level, and all these. We have not mentioned, if necessary, if all these other routes are stymied or ineffective, lawsuits, is there an option of going to court? Is that actually a realistic option for some parents or parents groups?
It's something that we are discussing. The issue is always with any of these issues, any of these problems that we're seeing on the ground, is that while there's a growing sense amongst Jewish parents that they need to fight this, they understand the danger, and that if they do nothing, it's only going to get worse. We're still contending with a large number of our Jewish community that is frightened about retaliation, which is understandable, that is very concerned, obviously, about their child getting into the right college. Of course, now knowing what's going on our college campuses, one should ask, what is the right college? But they're not willing to be as forceful and assertive in protecting not only their Jewish child, but all Jewish children. And so taking these sorts of legal actions requires a very organized, concerted effort, but it is something that is being potentially pursued.
All right, so this will be the last question. And is a tradition at Jewish Policy Center webinars, we like to ask our guests, no matter how difficult or sometimes actually depressing the topic, we like to ask them to finish with an optimistic, an answer that has some optimism in it. So let me ask you this way and try to provide that opportunity. So 5, 6 years ago, whatever it was, Rebecca Schgallis, former public school teacher at one of the country's most highly ranked high schools, Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Technology, teaching history and government. And 6 years later, Rebecca Schgallis doing battle with the same school system, and now school systems all around the country. What have you learned that gives you some optimism for the long run in this struggle?
So yeah, I fully aware that I'm often the bearer of bad news, um, but there is some optimism here, and I think that what we have seen, in the 3 years that I've been doing this and battling, my former school district and other school districts across the country, it was very difficult to get parents to come forward 3 years ago. As I said, there's a lot of fear in being public about this because the dangers are real. But what we have seen since October 7th is that perhaps there's a reckoning going on in the Jewish community. I see many Jewish parents realizing that things that they had supported for many years, things that they had even voted for, may be in fact harmful, and that there is this kind of turnaround that is occurring. It's not widespread, but it is definitely growing in strength. Yesterday when I was on Capitol Hill, parents joined us from across the country, and we had parents in California, parents from New York City. And these are some of the worst places where students are facing an enormous level of indoctrination from, their teachers and schools, and the student behavior is particularly hostile. But these are parents that have stepped up and decided that to remain silent. We know what happens when Jews remain silent. And so I think we are seeing a growing number of Jews willing to take on the responsibility of keeping all of the community safe. And courage is contagious. And the more of us who do that and step up, I am optimistic that more of us will get into this, and we will be able to push back. It may take time, but we can do it.
Rebecca Schgallis, on behalf of the Jewish Policy Center and our many webinar participants today, I want to thank you very much. Wish you success in your continued work, continued struggle. And I expect that I'll hear my phone ringing and you will call me about the next battle. So thanks again very much.
Thank you.